This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture. This is Joël, and this is Ep.3 of Season 2 of the Sonic Ventures podcast, Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. This conversation was recorded on January 13th, 2023. This conversation was definitely long overdue for me. I've wanted to talk about not only Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, but also Iron Maiden as a band, as a presence in the world of music for quite some time. And having this conversation with Rob was really ideal, especially where we are right now in the evolution of this podcast and in the evolution of our conversations and our friendship. It's interesting to note that the day that we recorded this episode was on Friday the 13th. Certainly a little piece of cultural symbolism that really resonates with the theatrics that one would find in Iron Maiden. And so it wasn't intentional, but it's definitely notable. The other thing that is rather distinctive about this conversation is how we spent time in the aftercast to discuss the music, not only in terms of this particular album, but also what makes Maiden's music sound like Iron Maiden. We got into every part of the band, the bass playing, the drumming, the guitar playing, the singing. We gave time to not only how these elements present themselves, but also how they work in their own right and together. So this episode, specifically the aftercast, was us moving into more territory of talking about the actual musical material. And it's something I'm looking forward to us delving deeper into and really bringing into more of the rhythm of our conversations and the whole aesthetic of this podcast. Now, before we get to the conversation, just a couple things I want to bring to your attention. The first is that we have a website, sonicventurespodcast.com. Now, if you go there, you will find links to all of the episodes that we've recorded so far. You'll also find our blog, and you'll also find some information about us, respectively. In addition to our website, we also have a Patreon page. And our Patreon page has a few extras for those of you who would like to hear more. So the first thing that we have on the Patreon page is something we call the Aftercast. So it's a conversation that we have post the actual episode that we intend to record. And these conversations are developing into some very interesting territory. They're getting a little bit more personal, and they're also an opportunity for us to maybe delve deeper into something that we only alluded to or hinted at in the actual episode. Along with the Aftercast, we also have something called Wildcards. They're short monologues that either Rob or I do about a particular topic or an idea or something that has come up during the podcast, or maybe something we've just thought about because of the conversation we had. And this episode is also introducing another extra we're offering, which is called vignettes. Now, vignettes are intended to be short conversations between Rob and I about a very particular maybe idea or issue or question or concept, what have you. And it's just a way for us to kind of really focus on something in a very short period of time. So this being our first vignette, we're actually making it available to everyone. But all future vignettes will be available only to our Patreon subscribers on our Patreon page. Now, if you want to check out our Patreon page, you can find the link at our website, or you can find us on the Patreon page by searching for Sonic Ventures. Finally, if you have any thoughts, any comments, you have any suggestions, there's a story or an experience you want to share related to anything we've talked about, you can very easily connect with us through email. Our email is sonicventurespodcast@gmail.com, and we would love to hear what you have to say, what you're thinking, what you're wondering about. And now, without further ado, here is our discussion of Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. Thanks for listening. Hello, Rob.
Hey, Joël.
So here we are for another episode. We're in season 2, and this is episode 3. And we're going to be delving into our first heavy metal concept album.
Awesome.
Yes, I'm very excited about this.
Yeah. It's been a long road, but a short time at the same time to get here. And it's really quite awesome to have selected the album that we've selected for this month's podcast, I guess.
Yeah, and it was both on our, for both of us, it was on our short list when we exchanged possible albums we wanted to do after doing Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours. And it was on both of our lists, so we just went ahead with it.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's an obvious one if you are going down the list of concept albums and you're looking at the metal category. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there are other choices as well, and this one just felt right for sure, I think, and it felt right not only in the timeline of the evolution of the podcast, but also, I think, right for us personally into sort of what we were getting ourselves prepared to listen to. So I think for both of us, we were looking forward to this journey, and so it became the selection.
And as you said, this is a pretty popular concept album to choose from the metal repertoire. It was on my very first list when we talked about doing this podcast, and I just came up with concept albums off the top of my head. This was on that initial list as well. So I guess you could say I've been waiting to do this one. And it's been really interesting for me to do this album because unlike the Sinatra, I have a long period of my life where I've been listening to this album. Like since it came out in '88, I've been listening to it. So it was one of the cases where listening to the album was different only because we were going to have this conversation. There's so much familiarity for me with this album. So it's a big contrast from after doing the Sinatra, go from something that you've never listened to before and then come into something that I could probably sing the lyrics and play the parts. And it's very, very interesting contrast to go from one to the other.
Yeah, that's really cool. And have we said the name of the album yet in the band?
Well, I don't think so. I think we've just been kind of creating some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Drama, although, of course, whatever the title of the podcast episode is, everyone already knows. And so they're probably like, it's redundant to have to say it. But I think with drama and fanfare, that would be appropriate for such a theatrical band as this one. Right.
Joël, please introduce this album.
Today we are talking about Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Very nice.
I would have produced a drum roll, but I didn't have adequate facilities in front of me.
We'll fix it in post. There we go.
Hey, that's not a bad idea.
Awesome.
It's in there. We'll do it.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about that because briefly and really quickly for me, although I'd heard this album before in my youth when it came out, right. I didn't have that listening history with it. I didn't own a copy of it. So okay. I'd probably mostly was familiar with it through the cuts that were released as singles. Right. And I think one or two videos that were
right, like
part
Can
of this.
I Play with Madness and the Evil That Men Do. Those are the big ones.
And then I may have heard it sort of as a like an album release kind of thing, like they used to do those radio simulcast events and that kind of stuff.
It's interesting when I was revisiting when I first heard this album and that I remembered how Much Music, which was big back in the day, because by then metal was really on Much Music, and they gave the album release a nice long segment, and I think they had all the members of the band in the Much Music studios, and they interviewed them for it. It was a big deal.
Very nice.
Yeah, and I think they even did some kind of they improvised a kind of little story of their own with the woman who was interviewing them. I can't remember her name right now. But anyways, they did their playful, you know how they have, Maiden has such a playful demeanor.
Yeah, that would be Erica M, right?
That's it.
That's right, of
Erica
course.
M. And they really, let's say, hammed it up.
Right.
So there was a lot when it came out. At least, I mean, I was privy to it because I was waiting for the album to come out when it did. So for you then, when was the first time that you actually listened to the entire album?
Well, since those days, not until we started discussing the idea of doing a concept album podcast, and like you, I developed a short list, and this is one of the albums that sort of came up on that radar. And I gave it a quick listen maybe about 6 months ago.
Okay.
Just to sort of as a refresher of as part of that process of making my short list, and sort of like, oh yeah, this would be something I would want to explore again for sure.
Oh, okay.
But it was, but unlike you, I was more like when you talk about waiting for this album and anticipating the release of it. I was that way for Somewhere in Time. Right. But, you know, I'm just a couple of years older than you. So I'm a grad 87.
Right.
So this album came out in 88.
Yeah.
And Power Slave came out, 85, 86, somewhere in there?
I think Power Slave came out 84 because Somewhere in Time came out in 86.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's right. So in 86, you know, I was sort of in my prime, sort of 16-year-old, 17-year-old. I'd missed Power Slave as a tour. My parents, at the time, I started going to concerts in 84, and my parents kept a pretty close stranglehold on how much they would let me do that. So my first concert was Van Halen, 1984, which was awesome.
Which I totally missed.
Yeah, May 1st, 1984, Pacific Coliseum. But my second concert, which unfortunately, like during that time period of 84, a big renaissance year for music, especially for our generation. The amount of albums and tours that are legendary must-see albums and tours that came to Vancouver in those months.
Yeah.
Rush, there was ZZ Top, Eliminator came through during that time period. There was so much to go to, but my parents were holding the trying to keep the gate closed before that happened. So my second concert was like not till November, so like 6 months later, and that was Michael Jackson's Victory Tour. But in the interim, I miss a couple of really key concert moments, which then made me rebel against my parents. So at that point going forward, I was very much going to every show that came through town.
But you didn't see Maiden.
I saw Maiden in Somewhere in Time.
You did. Yeah, I missed that.
Yeah. So I'd been anticipating that album because I'd missed Power Slave, and I enjoyed Power Slave so much, and the albums before Number of the Beast, and Peace of Mind. I loved both those albums. So I made sure I didn't miss Somewhere in Time. I got a great story about that. We'll get to at some point, I'm sure.
Cool.
But yeah, so Seventh Son, I'd already gone through that big anticipation thing, and I think where I was at my life when that album came out, I was either in my first or second year of university, and you know, it was I didn't have the exact same time to anticipate albums, but I remember, you know, being quite curious when it came out. I was really interested in the idea, but for you, this was big.
Well, I'll try and make it as brief as I can, because in terms of coming into this album, because my life with metal didn't start until I was like late grade 8, you know, so I was about 14 about that time. And the first time I actually heard Iron Maiden was when I was in grade 8. It was the first couple of months that I was in the whole high school mindset. And there was this air band battle of the bands.
Okay.
And they had, of course, all these people get up and do what they wanted to do. And this group of 5 guys get up on stage. They're all wearing Iron Maiden t-shirts. And I still didn't know what Iron Maiden was. I had no idea. And I'm not sure if they did Aces High or The Trooper. It was one or the other.
Okay.
And it was such an incredible thing to see because, first of all, I didn't know what was happening. Because at that time, unlike now, metal was something that you had to find outside the mainstream. Like it was a huge cultural base, but it wasn't in the mainstream of what you were hearing on the radio, at least out here. And so when I heard this, I didn't even know what to make of it. And when this guitar solo started in their performance, the lead singer pulled out a sword and started throwing it around. And unbeknownst to me, that guy would end up being one of my best friends when I was in high school.
Nice.
And he was the one who actually not only introduced me to Iron Maiden, but insisted upon my entering into Maidenness, which is interesting just as an aside, because I actually intentionally kept it on the low how much I liked Maiden, because I just didn't want him gloating in my face. Anyways, so for me, by the time I got into metal, the album that was happening was Somewhere in Time. So and at that point, unlike you, my parents weren't keeping me for anything, but I had a weird relationship with concerts. I didn't go to all of them. And there was a money piece to it, that. But anyways, the thing about Maiden for me, it started with Somewhere in Time. So of all the Maiden albums, Somewhere in Time for me is the first Iron Maiden album. And I was so taken by it because it was unlike anything else I had heard. Their use of the guitar synths and the arrangements and the sci-fi feel of it, which is a genre that I've always really been drawn to. So having that relationship with Somewhere in Time, I was even more excited about the next Maiden album because I had heard they were still going to use synths and that it was going to be a concept album. Because by the time that album was happening in my own life, I was really delving into big ideas, books, and I was getting into concept albums. And so I started to build this anticipation and expectation for this album, which I'll get into a little bit later. So when I first heard this album was when it came out. And I got it on cassette. I didn't get it on vinyl. And that was the beginning for me with this album.
Yeah, so that's cool. When you talk about Maiden in any capacity, you have to sort of almost go back to the beginning of that image. You know, the image of Eddie and the art and like you say, yeah, and the t-shirts and you know, for me, my first exposure to Maiden would have been through Number of the Beast and Run to the Hills.
Yeah.
After that, you know, that exposure, I you know, we saw videos, women in uniform with the original singer,
Paul,
yeah, and you sort of reconstructed the history by going backward. But for me, it started sort of with Run to the Hills and Number of the Beast, which had, you know, initially that image, the Eddie image. When I first saw that, I was, you know, like 12 years old or something.
Right.
And was a fan of definitely of hard rock, but always a little wary of sort of like metal, if in its sort of Satan incarnation of metal. Right. And so when you see that image, or at least when I saw that image of Eddie as a child or as a young boy, you didn't really know what's going on there, right? Yeah. And so there was a push pull of just from that image. It was absolutely compelling. Like I could find myself going to the record store and picking up vinyl copies and just just looking, like standing there looking at the album, like you're holding some sort of stone tablet almost, like or this iconography that was, had all these overtones of these adult possibilities of that were just doors I hadn't opened yet.
See, and I thought when I saw those images, the one that stuck out the most at first was the Killers,
right?
And I thought it was punk. I didn't really think of it as being metal, but I'm with you there. There was something very compelling about the imagery, but also a little off-putting. There was an element of danger, and intrigue. And then at the same time, there was also this, I guess it was my artistic nature, was just appreciation for the aesthetic and how well the images were made and crafted. And I think that that whole culture around the T-shirts, how that was the biggest marketing tool of metal. That's what made Metallica what they were, and Megadeth. Everyone had to have their clear logos, and those logos had to have some kind of draw, and they had to bear some kind of, or exude some kind of weight, or even supremacy or power. And so the whole image, I agree with you with Eddie, was that it was very compelling. And that was why Somewhere in Time was really interesting to me too, was because of how he was put into that sci-fi
very
genre.
Rich too, like a lot going on in Somewhere in Time on that cover, like to really absorb and little things to observe in the art was Now at the same time, the early 80s in particular, we were in the beginnings, or possibly in the full-throated cycle of the satanic panic, so we, you had culturally, North America was much more, we'll call it Christian in terms of its overt value system and the sort of political minority was loud in that sort of Christian fundamentalist kind of talk, and so something like Eddie and even just the song title, like The Number of the Beast, those were really bad, heavy, prohibited things that kids were supposed to be kept from, and suggestive of all kinds of crazy stuff. We already had the backwards message BS that was part of the cultural sort of talk at the time, and so this all blended into that. Little did we know as young people, and certainly parents didn't know this at the time, that you probably couldn't get further away from Satan than Iron Maiden. That what attracted kids outside of the verboten element, which was definitely an attraction, was that these were cool images of detail and imagination, and they were cartoons, right? And in many ways, and so it's interesting as I grew from that first exposure, when I actually got listening to Maiden, my assumptions about what they were before I listened to what they were after I listened were turned on their head. But as a Maiden fan, whenever you met someone, you did have to kind of hold back a little bit on your dropping Maiden, unless you were a T-shirt wearer, right? You kept that card a little closer because you didn't want to have to go into the explanation to turn around the assumption or the prejudice to actually, no, these guys they're prog nerds.
Well, and there was, in our time too, there was this thing about in high school culture, was that you were into one kind of music, which was something that was was kind of a problem for me, because I was into all kinds of things.
Right.
So I couldn't have a conversation with someone about Iron Maiden, Rush, Bach, and Alan Holdsworth. It wasn't going to happen. That conversation was always going on in my head. And so you're right. There was kind of like these, I wouldn't call them statuses, but there were these enclaves. And
it was very tribal.
Yeah, it was tribal. You were grouped, whether you wanted to be or not, by what kind of music you listened to, and of course the clothing that you wore. But you're right with something like Maiden, where if you went down that road of talking about Maiden, it was far more comfortable to do it with other people who knew the music. Otherwise, it was a little complicated because...
Oh, yeah.
And that's why I was mentioning how I was introduced to Maiden and my friend was because I got it all at once. It wasn't, I said, oh, this Somewhere in Time's great. And it's like, well, Somewhere in Time, you got to listen to Peace of Mind. And have you seen Live After Death? And so all of these, Maiden was like, it was almost like, as an institution, the whole building fell on me at once.
Wow.
It was quite incredible.
Yeah.
But again, Somewhere in Time was the most captivating for me because I found it to really, because they use synths.
Yeah.
It harkened to my relationship with orchestral music.
Sure.
Whereas in a lot of other music that I was listening to, you could hear those elements of classical, like, in Malmsteen or in Randy Rhoads' work, you could hear some of those iterations. But there was something about Somewhere in Time that kind of stirred up that area of orchestral music that I was interested in. And there was a grandeur in the band's style of music.
You were able to find elements within that connected you to your greater understanding and appreciation of music in general. Like those threads, you were at such a place that you were able to surf those connective threads and appreciate them.
Right, but I had to keep them to myself.
Yeah.
And I even had to keep, and I mean, when I say that, that's just how I felt at the time. I do believe there's some truth to it. Maybe there was also my own concerns about being ostracized or mocked or shamed or whatever. Oh, you like Bach, what a nerd, blah, blah, blah. But I think that the thing about Somewhere in Time, which I think brings us really well into talking about Seventh Son, is I really felt like something new was going on. And because that was right around the time that the idea of synths being in metal a little bit more was gaining more traction. And again, I mentioned that sci-fi element to Somewhere in Time. That's one of the things I love about sci-fi is it's an expansive genre. It's broadening, no matter where it goes or how it goes. Because it always evokes the openness of space, the openness of the evolution of technology, or just the basic idea of exploration is a huge component to it. So when Seventh Son was on its way, like I said, I started creating hopeful content for the album that was going to happen.
Wow.
And I, at the point that when it came out, I know that it came out in the spring, but it very quickly became a winter album for me, specifically because of the cover.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And talk more about that.
So it just happened that way. That for some reason the cover compelled me to make this a winter entity. And so even to this day, whenever the season starts to change, I'm thinking about listening to a few albums, and this is always one of them. Is Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
Yeah, no, that makes me think of the album covers as a unto themselves,
right.
And the stories that Iron Maiden was telling both on their album covers of Eddie, and there was this idea that there was a through line narrative both on album covers with the development of the Eddie character.
Yeah.
And on the tours, what happened or what sort of Eddie did, or what they did to Eddie on the tours. And so I can remember when new albums would come out, the dialogue was a lot often based on what's going on with Eddie.
Yeah.
Who seemed to embody his own character, his own narrative outside of the band's narrative and outside of the music itself. So like that there was some other thing going on through the covers and through the t-shirts and through the posters that was telling this sort of other journey at the same time. So I found that, it was like a parallel line, like a parallel narrative that was happening outside the music. And as you charted through from Number of the Beast through to Power Slave, through to Peace of Mind, the album covers kind of mirrored, the art mirrored the title, which sort of was part of that narrative. And,
right.
So you get Peace of Mind and you've got Eddie in a straitjacket with the skull that had been obviously removed, a piece of his mind. And somewhere in time, Eddie is now like this sort of like cyber robot, cyborg thing in some future Blade Runner space opera. And then Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, Eddie, for me, he's in some sort of Nordic, Icelandic winterscape.
Yeah.
In sort of somehow disembodied or partially disembodied.
Yeah.
And I that's where I lost the thread. Like I could never make out what that album cover was in that Eddie narrative, and in particular as it related to Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
Well, and this is why I was disappointed when the album came out.
Yeah.
But I wasn't at the same time. So this album, for me, because I built so much up, I was expecting a lot. And one of the things that I expected was I wanted something that wasn't an adaptation of something else. Now, granted, we're all influenced by what's come before us, what we're exposed to. But because where I was in my own evolution in my own creativity, there was a depth that was lacking for me with this album. And I remember when they were on Much Music, and I actually went online to see if I could find that on YouTube, and someone has posted it.
Oh, nice.
And I watched it because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't remembering something that I had made up. And I remember watching an interview with them, and when they were talking about the album, they couldn't explain it. They couldn't talk about the cover and say, yeah, this symbolizes this and it means this. And they were being silly and playful to a point that it actually annoyed me, because I wanted more depth from what they had done. And when I say depth, like I'll tell you straight up, I wanted a double album, and I wanted maybe even a book of Derek Riggs's images of this whole world that they were presenting. But at the same time, I loved the music. The songs on this album are so strong, and they move into one another so well. And there's so many places that I feel that we can go with that, and I hope we do, about talking about the music and that.
Yeah.
But just to kind of put it out there, because I've never said this to anyone ever, is that I love Seventh Son the way it is, but it wasn't what I wanted. And one way that I thought about it right now, listening to it and looking at the lyrics, is that I felt like it was a Shakespearean play that had all the soliloquies lifted out of it, and that's what we got. I felt like there wasn't enough world texture. The world building wasn't complete enough for me. And that's me. Like, that's totally on me, because really, Maiden has this amazing capacity to, as Bruce Dickinson said, plunder cultures and adapt them, but they only go so far, because there's this playful momentum about their personalities, I think, in the band. And if perhaps if they go certain ways with it, they might undermine what actually comes out to be these amazing songs. So, of course, I'm not in the band. I can't name this stuff. I can't really analyze it that way. But I feel that Seventh Son, having listened to it for this podcast, made me reflect on that very idea of how I can very easily build things up the way I'd like them to be, and then have to go through accepting what happens. So again, I love this album. I think it's fabulous. But at the same time, I still carry that bit about, I think they could have done more. And I found an interview with Dickinson in Kerrang, and he actually said, I don't know when the interview was. I think it was like maybe about 5 or 7 years ago, something like that. He actually said, I wish we had done more with it.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right on that, and not just Bruce, even Harris as well.
Oh, okay.
The band, I think, shares that exact same thought, and that's okay.
Yeah,
like
totally.
That, depending on where we go with this, how much time we have, and what just as a sort of general bit of the podcast format, we're going to go through this conversation. And when it's concluded, we're going to have a second conversation that really is continuation of this conversation in our aftercast. And that usually goes in...
who knows where?
Yeah, who knows where, and even more so, knows where than this. So really, who knows where that conversation will go? But hopefully we can cover some stuff in these discussions. But yeah, the band... I look at that and have that exact same thought about this album, and I look at the band at that point in their career, not only as a band but as young men, men that were sort of peaking and had this amazing sort of flourish of success and growth as young men. And we're just transitioning into what kind of man am I going to be? They'd sort of come through their 20s and into their 30s. I think they may have been at this point just beginning or starting to, and they're changing. They are by virtue of the incredible amount of touring that they've done, and the exposure to audiences and cultures and countries.
Not to mention going from Peace of Mind to Power Slave to Somewhere in Time. Like those 3 albums, that is your canon. That just in that, the breadth of those 3 albums alone. They sold out Hammersmith Odeon Theatre, 3 nights in a row for Live After Death, and that was for Power Slave.
Right. And if you look at the UK at this point in time, metal wasn't exactly on top of the world there. It was not ruling the pop charts. Had metal, and it's interesting you brought up them as, your initial impression of them through Killers as the artwork as a punk band.
Right.
And in some ways they were both a punk band, but also trying to be a band in the face of growing up and being a band in the punk era. So they were punk enough,
right?
But at the same time, they weren't punk, because
I remember Dickinson in the Rush documentary. He was interviewed, and he described Maiden as Rush, but in your face.
Yeah, I mean, they're. Prog was a dirty word, right? And hard rock and music and musical ability in punk in the UK was culturally verboten at the time, and so they were a pub band trying to be a prog band with metal and storytelling and theatrics
and 2 guitars. Very important.
When at the time, the punk music scene in the UK through the end of the 70s was very much anti everything that was that, except for the hard edge element of it, right?
Right.
So punk and early Iron Maiden shared that hard edge element. Paul was once he got into the band, it was a very sort of punky looking singer, and his obviously his vocal range was much more limited than the operatic range of Dickinson. But his aesthetic was more punk, but they were, as their music evolved and as they evolved culturally as a band through that time period, they matured, right? They
and there's
grew.
The word that's coming to my mind that you've used a few times in other episodes is talking about artists working towards legitimacy.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that is really compelling about Maiden, is how legitimate they've made themselves. I can't remember the quote verbatim right now, but Lady Gaga, when she was compared to Madonna, apparently she had said, "No, I want to be like Maiden." And she what she said in that moment was, it was about the music and the band's relationship with the audience.
Yeah, well, and she calls her fans like little monsters or something like that. That's her, like she has a name for her audience, right? But basically, join the club, right?
So Maiden built their institution.
Yeah. So
by the time Seventh Son came out, like you're saying, that there was a kind of a plateau that they were coming to.
Yeah.
In hindsight bias, or in retrospect, however you want to put it, they were coming to this plateau, and for me, I wanted it to be have a scale to it that they hadn't hit yet. And what it was attention to detail, I think. But again, that's me. That's my mind and where my heart tends to be creatively. But when this album came out and I was listening to it and delving into it, that was the piece about how the world that they were presenting, everything was there musically as far as I was concerned. They used acoustic guitars. They hadn't done that before. On Can I Play With Madness, there was a cowbell, which I never hear anybody talk about, but it's in there. And then they had refined their sound. They kept the guitar players, Adrian Smith and Dave Murray, kept the Galen Kruger sound, because they switched in Somewhere in Time to Galen Krugers from Marshall. And Galen Krugers have this kind of inherent, it's kind of like Roland jazz chorus amps.
Yeah, very solid state, right?
Very solid state, but they also have this amazing a veneer around the sound, like it softens it a little bit. And so in Somewhere in Time, when I listen to it, you can hear the digital click of that tech at the time. But then when you get to Seventh Son, that click has been dealt with, and they're still using Galen Kruger amps, and the sound that they merged with the synths that they chose to use, they got off the guitar synths, and it was this amazing coalescing of all these textures and that history that they had already built. And so sonically, they were there for me. Like, this is it. Like this is not only a kind of plateau, but it means I can't imagine where they'll go from here. There's so many things you can do. And then with that, there was, for me, trying to reconcile that with what I was missing out on lyrically and conceptually.
Yeah.
And when I learned that it was, Moonchild was based on Aleister Crowley's novel, and I had by that time, I was really into Crowley, and I'd read most of his stuff.
So you did the Crowley thing. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I did. Oh, did I ever? I can tell you the books that I think, if someone came up to me and said, tell me about Aleister Crowley, I'd say, read these 2 books, and then that's it. You'll get it. But I did that. And so knowing that Moonchild was based on Crowley, that Seventh Son book of Orson Scott Card, and how Steve Harris had begun basically the writing process about Doris Stokes and her death, and she was a medium, a psychic, and that's what compelled him to write the song The Clairvoyant. So there was the usual mishmashing of elements.
Yeah.
But what I didn't know, which I discovered in getting ready for this episode, was the camaraderie that happened between them because of where they were. Dickinson had said in a number of interviews that he had felt like he wasn't really contributing to the band. He wasn't offering up lyrics.
Well, he'd been shut out the album before, right?
Yeah.
I think, if I remember correctly, he had brought a whole bunch of acoustic tracks and softer music. Now, whether he was about to do a Ritchie Blackmore and go off with a Renaissance, right. Maiden, but had been rejected from those, and so the band was in peril.
They were, and
before that,
and Adrian Smith contributed a lot to this album.
Yeah,
and he was pleased about that. And there was an energy, and there was also what I discovered too was that there was more communication between them because of that through the creation of the album. And I really feel that I get that when I listen to this album. There's an energy and there's a vitality that comes through that it evokes peace of mind.
And you're right to talk about you're right to talk about the synergy of the co-writing relationship, because you see you don't just see two camps, right, or
right.
individuals. You see, although Harris has his his stranglehold on his position in the band always. So he's definitely writing his tracks, but he's also collaborating, and he's also, part of mixed collaborations, or not. He's also not part of some songs
right.
On the writing side.
But there's a communication that seemed to be really happening between all of them.
Exactly. And like you said, there was, if you look at, if we get into the discussion of how the concept album is, doesn't follow a single conceptual narrative. It's really more of an inspired thematic narrative with a few, we'll call it consistent narrative, either stories or connective tissues.
Or even just words like seven.
Yeah. So, sometimes.
Or sun.
Well, I can imagine like the way I read the interviews between how the album came about was literally, like you said, I think it was Harris reading a book. This is a cool book, and this
is our seventh album.
And this is our seventh album, and he's talking, and everyone just kind of got excited and inspired, and it was enough of a kernel to sort of drive them towards sort of a center, to overcome some of the we'll call it the hard feelings and the hurts and the hurdles that they were faced with. And it's almost like it gave them a reset.
Yes.
That they could let go of that history and dive into this with just bringing their artistry. It's almost all the animosities were left aside, and you saw fresh materializations of collaborative pairings and triplings.
And some of their most interesting arrangements. Like when I think about Infinite Dreams.
Yeah. Wow.
So well crafted for a song that keeps evolving. How many Iron Maiden songs do you know that start differently than they end? There's not many. And probably most of them are on this album. So
yeah. I was going to say, I could think of 7 or 8.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
All right. I take that back.
Yeah.
But in terms of the some of the ways that they push themselves, I think, in arranging and letting the music breathe.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. Like the song Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, when there's that really beautiful long interlude, and you've got Nico McBrain just holding the eighths on the hi-hat forever.
Yeah.
And there's all this textural stuff that comes in, and they go so far as to bring in these really great guitar delay punctuations, but they're not on the grid. They're syncopated.
Yeah.
So there's this feeling about an attention to detail to the music that's really, it's not any, I don't think it's any different than other albums. Like, I'm not saying that they haven't given that attention, but I think in the camaraderie or the community of the band, there's a sense of that attention to detail together that's there.
I think part of that process, typically they would embed in the studio and a location, you know, sort of. So it is almost like an encampment, and with the band, but their whole team, like, you know, they record over a period of weeks to months sometimes, right? And then already with the next tour being booked and ready before the album's even done. So there was always an element of time pressure. And I think coming into this with such collaborative writing, just allowed them, when they were in the studio, less of a, I don't want to say pissing contest, but less acrimony or tension in terms of what they were laying down in the studio in terms of parts and stuff, and just allowed them to be themselves there, you know, sort of as a band. And so I get that. I get much more harmonious, even the instrumental passages, just because I imagine, at least it's my imagination, that harmony or that esprit de corps that they brought to those sessions, with that joyousness of that just carried through into the music.
When I was doing whatever degree of research that I felt comfortable doing, like with all these albums, like you and I both said that there's only so much of other people's opinions that we're much more concerned on our listenings,
sure,
as opposed to that.
Exactly.
Reading about how Harris felt pressure to write and finish "Rime of the Ancient Mariner" is really interesting to me, because actually that's my Maiden track go-to. Like, to me, that's my favorite Iron Maiden track, and just to hear that he was under pressure to get that done. And then when I think about Seventh Son and just how you laid it out right now, this is something maybe we could get into more in the aftercast, but this idea of running something like that's an institution that has so many other moving parts, where, like you said, before the session is done, there's already a gig booked.
Yeah.
Really enters into the creative dynamics of their working together. And I just find it interesting, because I feel that when I listen to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I don't hear any anxiety except in the story. Right? Like I only hear the story of the mariner. Yeah. But the whole song, don't worry, I'll come back to Seventh Son.
Yeah.
The whole song just has this amazing lightness, and it's almost like a ponderous objectivity of calm when they tell that story, because of its length and because of the way the material works. And then when I think about Seventh Son, this was something that occurred to me a few days ago, was that I only feel, here we go. The gallop isn't about getting away from anything or an urgency to get anywhere. Right. I feel them in the pocket of the gallop, of the rhythm. Like, I feel them sunk into what they're doing. And actually, they did a later album called Life After Death.
Yeah.
No, not
Life
After Death. Sorry,
album,
not Life After Death. It's Matter of Life or Death.
Okay.
And when I heard that it's all the original members plus Yannick Gers,
right?
So they're now a 3-guitar band, which is probably a good idea for Maiden. Yeah. They recorded that live off the floor.
Wow.
And when you listen to it, you can feel that. And so when I listened to A Matter of Life or Death, it immediately reminded me of this album. because even though they didn't record it the same way,
Yeah.
there's like a joie de vivre about this album that I think is actually why I keep coming back to it. I keep wanting to listen to it because it doesn't feel like it's trying to get away or get to anything. It's just in itself,
right,
musically, performance-wise.
So notable moment in the podcast, the first mention of Gallup.
Well, come on. We have to talk about the Gallup if we're going to talk about Iron Maiden.
Absolutely. I really get that. And it's really interesting because, they as a band, they got better. Like as players, they got better. And at this point in time, they, themselves would fully admit that, this wasn't Yes, but even Yes did this, is that these songs were so long.
Yeah.
You can't, you do a take on a 13-minute song and you get 7 minutes in and you blow your part. That kind of sucks for the band and for you. So they recorded in segments, right?
Yes.
And composed in segments. And this album is really interesting because you can hear them as they sort of peaked at this sort of chapter in their musical self-growth, self-education, that you can see that there's both those sort of arbitrary transitions, where they just where the band suddenly they don't have, say, the music theory or vocabulary to know how to cadence out of this into this naturally. So they have a few tropes and things that they do that sort of smash into the next section. So you can hear some of that, but then you can also hear where they have been able to evolve their language and sort of their toolkit, and those transitions are much more fluid and less arbitrary.
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting contrast of the band sort of in their old, we're doing prog without or classical without a classical education or background, right?
Yeah.
We know Yes did this, and somehow they made this section work with this section, and so we're going to do it too. And so there was that old school element, but then the band that had evolved the skill set with a new sonic vocabulary that was able to be much closer to say yes than they, that they may have aspired to younger, but now they're actually, sort of becoming much closer to to that than they were, and so it's a neat thing to observe those musical changes and those sectional interludes on these things but one of the cool things about all the songs on the album, every song has its moments and its transitions like that, and you can have little favorite sections or and on repeated listens you can start to build the anticipation up of that change that's coming, that section that's coming. And it's one of the things I really loved about the experience of this is how easily excited I could get for that change I was coming. Because one of the common elements of a Maiden composition is that in the verses of songs, the verses are often sort of talk narrative driven, right? They're sort of musical theater. They're to deliver a narrative line. The less musically interesting, but it's what comes after those. So as you're listening through the narrative and through the story, you're anticipating this high drama moment of musical interlude or musical change that's coming. And because this album is so rich, with each song having sometimes like 3 or 4 or 5 really specifically different sectional changes that way.
Yeah.
Plus they're delivering a narrative, plus they've got the big chorus, the magic of listening to this and the excitement of being able to anticipate what's coming, it's like going to a candy bar store, and there's all these candy bars there, and you're like, oh, I like Coffee Crisp. Oh, there's the Crispy Crunch. Oh, I want this. Like I don't know which one to like the most. Like that, it's like as it comes, and that's often one of the questions that Maiden fans love to debate and ask. What's your favorite song on this album, right?
Yeah.
Or what's your favorite moment? I'm going to assume there's maybe too many on this to say. Like for me, there's certain things I have a hard time picking a favorite.
Yeah.
But do you have? You talk about Infinite Dreams. Do you have one that shines for you?
Well, dramatic pause. No, I feel this album as a whole.
Yeah.
So right now, when you asked me that question, I went back to Somewhere in Time. And I could easily say that for Somewhere in Time.
Yeah.
But I can't say it for this album because it just does what I said, I think at the beginning, was that everything just flows well from track to track as well. So if I heard Can I Play with Madness, it's like, oh, okay, Moonchild. And then all the way through. Yeah. I don't want to miss any of it. It's like what we've talked about with Pink Floyd. Right? I don't, if I hear Money, it's, well, okay, I got to listen to the whole song when I get home, or the whole album when I get home now.
Yeah, I got to balance it out.
Yeah, so, and it's not the case for me with any other Maiden album. Like Peace of Mind, I have very particular tunes that I like, and other tunes I don't need to listen to. And it's the same way with, actually, wait a minute. Oh, no, wrong.
Breaking news.
Power Slave.
Yeah.
Front to back.
Yeah.
Even though Rime of the Ancient Mariner is, like, to me, the Maiden song. Yeah. Power Slave from front to back. But I will say that it doesn't compel it in me as strongly as this album. This album really, but Power Slave, every track on Power Slave for me is great, all the way. But it's not the same as this album, and it's probably because of what I said about how I just feel that joie de vivre in it, right? Yeah. Like it's just so. There's a celebratory feel from the album that I get. Now, of course, we've said that there was camaraderie and a time of them really coming together, and we don't know the ins and outs of that. But for me, that's what I feel in the album when I listen to it is that feel piece. And I think part of that is it's because of everyone's roles. It's not just because of one thing. The drumming is remarkable. The bass playing is remarkable. The guitar parts are remarkable. The singing is remarkable. So that's probably why when I think about Power Slave, even though I like all those tunes, things become... There are parts of those songs that have a little bit more attention than others. Whereas I feel that there's an equanimity in the tracks of this album. And it's funny because when I was first introduced to Maiden, like I was saying before, when I was so caught up in Somewhere in Time, I was like, oh no, you got to hear Peace of Mind. You got to go back. And it's interesting because if someone went up to me and asked me, well, you like Iron Maiden, so what should I listen to? I would probably say, well, I could say these albums, but then if I was really, really going to say, okay, from my perspective, it would be a selection of tracks and then Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. Power Slave, maybe I'd say listen to all of it, but there's something about my impression that I got from this album, even though it didn't deliver conceptually, which is interesting to me, how that has played out for me.
Yeah, And that's, it's part of the charm of this album. I get their own sort of post disappointment or post I wish we had gone into this deeper. Because I think that who they are today and the men that they matured into would have taken this deeper and could have, they both intellectually with
especially with what Dickinson did after he left the band.
Yeah.
And by the way, wrote a terrible script. I watched Crowley.
Oh, you did. Eh?
And it's way off the mark.
Yeah.
It just became sensationalized. It's more of what Crowley wanted people to get caught up about him. It wasn't really him.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like I think there's a place they're in now that they probably wouldn't have addressed. They wouldn't have tackled it the same way.
Yeah. I mean, that's when you consider how much touring that they did, from the time they were like 22 to,
like all the time.
All the time. So,
time.
Although your growth is funneled along the rhythms of that lifestyle, tour, record, the band needing reflection and marination, and different members of the band benefiting from that, definitely, I think, gave us a better Maiden, and, Maiden is still a band, not just still a band. They are an active force of nature, institution, breaking new ground and new markets still, and, selling out stadiums, a true international band as well.
I watched... Actually, I don't want to forget to ask you, what's the takeaway tracks for you from this album?
Sure, no problem.
We'll come back to that in a sec. I watched on the Maiden channel, Dickinson talking about his backstage.
Oh, I saw that too. Yeah.
It was very interesting to watch someone explain something that seemed to have little to do with playing music.
Yeah.
Like how many costume changes he does, and how if he doesn't get on stage at the right time, the whole thing's going to fall apart. Like, and just seeing who's backstage. I've always been interested in that with the large acts where the stage is this kind of like this threshold, and on either side of it are completely different worlds.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
You have the audience and the band playing on one side, and then on the other side is the band off stage and all the people who are making you think that is the show. Like all these people who are working to be invisible. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
I watched that same two-part thing, I think it was. Yeah. And it was fascinating. First, I mean, this is, if you don't understand how or what we mean by theater with this band and their shows, I mean, this is pure stagecraft. It's musical theater in its most basic theatrical machination and presentation. Like there's he's talking about, like you say, costume changes and cues and
flamethrowers,
props and flamethrowers, and each song and Maiden songs. We can look at some of the idiomatic or elements that comprise a Maiden composition. I started writing down notes.
The Maiden tropes.
The Maiden tropes, and I got about 16.
Oh yeah,
maybe 16 to 18, and I thought, wow, this list is getting long. And but one of those things is each song is often very narrative. It's like he's telling a story. And each performance, in particular for the way Bruce approaches the music, is that, he is an impresario that's going out to tell that story. And so he's acting and he's singing and the band is playing. And he's with the band, but he's also separate in a way. Because the band plays on. Like he's off the stage.
Oh yeah, they don't leave. He's off and on all the time.
And so as he comes in and out as this sort of master of ceremonies, as this narrator or orator, and as the actor that is, sort of turning this music into theater. It's a very interesting contrast.
And he's not a young man.
No,
and he flies the band everywhere.
which is, how cool is that?
But I don't want to forget to ask you, for Seventh Son of the Seventh Son, are there any takeaway tracks for you on this album?
Yes, and like you, this is an album that, as I listen to, either a side at a time, or the whole album at a time.
And you can tell that it's constructed that way.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's awesome, and that's in part because of it, this album was released on vinyl, and so it was still informed, although it came out in the sort of the beginning of the boom of CDs. It was still very much regulated by what a vinyl album would be in terms of length and structure. So it's definitely got that. And as you talked about the origins of the narrative, it's got the Seventh Son of the Seventh Son series narrative on side 2. That's really much more of a Harris sort of focused writing. And then you've got side 1, which is a series of collaborations that each tell a different story with overlapping similar themes that may or may not relate to the story Steve is telling on side 2. You can read them different ways. There's the Crowley, there's the Book of Revelation, but sometimes there's just, like you say, the word in common that sort of carries through, because it didn't really matter exactly how it fit in. It felt like it fit in, and they were excited to try and make it fit in. And so I've got no problem listening to one side and then the other side as individual sides or as a whole. Songs that stand out to me are little moments. Like I love, and I find myself at home while I was listening, I would walk into the kitchen and I would go, "Moon Child," and I'd sort of wail out this Moon Child
scream.
And hear the Mandrake scream. It would just make me laugh, right? And I just kept going back to that. There's on the Clairvoyant. I love this sort of French Revolution. Yes, it's for me. This is like it's. Napoleon Bonaparte and
that's a great way to put it, as long as people who are listening to this are familiar with French Revolution.
Yes.
But there's that imperial charge.
But of that specific era, like it's got that. It very much to me is a Vive la France kind of sound to it. I love that element in particular. And as I go through my notes here, that one stood out a lot for me. And the Prophecy I really enjoyed. I loved just some of the guitar work and some of the harmony guitar work on that. I really enjoyed that. I found myself probably playing side 1 more. And going to side 1 more as a side. And just the transitions were actually refreshing between songs.
When you go from like Can I Play with Madness to The Evil That Men Do. And how that song starts and it just kind of pulls back a bit. And then it builds itself. And
it's funny to mention Can I Play with Madness, because Can I Play with Madness is it's an interesting song. It's a pop song in some ways.
Yeah, it got them on the charts.
It got them on the charts. It's got some atypical Maiden elements to it that some of which we saw on Somewhere in Time for the first time, sort of in Wasted Years or Stranger in a Strange Land. There were elements that you can see that evolution into Can I Play with Madness.
And especially when you draw from a song like Wasted Years that was on Somewhere in Time, that's Adrian Smith's desire for them to kind of go into, I don't want to call it mainstream because I don't think that's how he was thinking, but you're right about that. And that whole use of the cowbell in there
Yeah.
is so interesting, how they mixed it so that it almost has the same dynamic range as a floor tom. It doesn't, it's not like that SNL joke about I want to hear more cowbell.
Yeah,
It's totally the opposite. It's really well set somewhere like in its volume and its dynamic range between a floor tom and a snare. It's like the engineering on that I thought was brilliant.
So, now my drive home is going to be cowbell. I'm going to have to go back and listen for cowbell.
And don't forget that Graham Chapman was in the video.
Oh, yeah.
For Can I Play With Madness?
That Monty Python, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. One of his last
I think that was his
things?
last thing he shot.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you're saying about side one. Because for those of you who are younger, side one we're talking about is the first 4 tracks.
Yeah.
And side 2 is the last 4 tracks. There is a feel difference between both those sides.
Yeah.
I agree with you there. And there's almost like a speed, a momentum through the first side that the second side doesn't have. And the second side kind of opens up a little bit more, especially because of Seventh Son, I feel.
Yeah, and it's funny because for me initially, if I have to talk about songs that I like the least on this album, I tend to shy away from Can I Play With Madness?
Yeah,
that's my initial sort of like, I'm too cool for school, that's too poppy for me kind of reaction.
Big of you to admit to.
Yeah, and then of course it's the one I sing along with all the time and pretend I'm Bruce. So
that's actually when I'm crossing the street and someone always hits me.
Yeah,
like,
you go.
I play with madness.
Yeah, yeah. So we're way too similar sometimes. Then the other one that I found hard to get into at first was Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, because of the fact that when you first hear Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, what you're overwhelmingly listening to and hearing is Bruce repeat the phrase,
yes,
Seventh Son of a Seventh Son,
yeah,
Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And he does that 8 times, by the way. But it's doubled, so it's 16 times. So first, my disappointment at one point was as I realized, after refamiliarizing myself with it, as it was coming up, I was like, how many times is he singing this? It better be 7 at this point, because I thought at least that would be redemptive.
Right.
And of course he goes 8 cycles through it. And so I thought, oh, you kind of dropped the ball
See,
there,
if
Bruce.
if you listen to more Haydn,
yeah,
this would make sense, because you're right in that I think the song Seventh Son of a Seventh Son verges on camp. It comes very close because of that, but also because when they put that in, for me, when they put that little interlude in there and he does that spoken bit.
Yeah.
What used to happen to me back in the day was you haven't told us anything about this. Yeah. What does this mean? Like why are you telling me this? Mm-hmm. And that's why I mentioned the idea of soliloquies. There's textures missing from this world that would not only elevate some moments like that, but the funny thing for me about what you're saying about Seventh Son, him repeating that, is eventually I just thought, no, this is great. It's like Haydn. It just goes on and on and on until eventually you say, yeah,
you surrender to it.
You surrender to it.
And and so that's again what happened to me. It's like my initial like, really? Is that, we're not going any deeper than just saying Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, Seventh Son of a, is that all we're doing here, Bruce and Steve? But then it gets into your ear, and of course the musical elements of this that come after, the Germanic elements, that are part of the composition. Seventh Son of the Seventh Son really then just becomes, oh, this is more of a mantra. And, so
That's a very good word to use, because I was just going to also relate it to Carmina Burana.
Well, exactly. When I said Germanic, that's where I was sort of going. And this is sort of like, almost like, without placing it in time, but almost like a medieval or maybe more of a Renaissance mantra. It's got that sort of Germanic folk mantra or something coming to it, right?
Or you could even go Middle Ages with Gregorian chant.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. No, and you're right. And I think that I've listened to so much music in my life, and I came to a point in my life where I stopped trying to be something I'm not as a listener, and just admit, you know what? I like this. And
nice.
I can't reconcile it with the other things I like. So basically, it was my teenage self who hid things.
Yeah.
Just saying, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so when we have the first snow here, when we do have it, whenever that is now, out in this part of the world, I'm thinking seventh son of a seventh son.
Wow. Seventh
son of a seventh son. And I'm thinking of that cover that was never explained to me. Mm-hmm. It's okay.
Yeah.
And the bit about what you were saying is how we're making connections to other forms of music. I'm sure there's some people who, if they're familiar with Haydn, they love Haydn, would find what I said to be disturbing. I don't know. But I think that over time, how I've integrated my supposed musical disparities has served me so much that an album like this, when I was listening to this, I had to go listen to Power Slave. And then I had to go listen to Sun and Steel on Peace of Mind, because I love that song.
Well, I think
that's one of the best Maiden gallops.
Yeah. So would you say then that unlike our other podcasts up until this point, for me, I think we're saying the same thing. I listened to this massive amount of times, but I also couldn't get enough of just Maiden, period. I listened to a lot of Maiden from all the albums that are favorites of mine.
Basically, it was like all the other albums we've done. Welcome to this gallery. We understand you're here to see this particular room.
Yeah.
Take as much time as you like. In this album, it's been, I'm going to go through the whole thing.
Sweet.
So yeah, I rotated, because part of it is I can just call up the album from memory without listening to it. So for me to listen to it, I actually started a bit by reading about what I could find about the history of the album and seeing what interviews I could find on YouTube from that time, which were of very little use at all, because Maiden was just being silly and not really answering questions, which is fine.
Yeah, and they may not have really had, the answers were, I don't know, we just got excited about this basic general idea, and we just kind of went off and did it.
Which is the same kind of answer that frustrates people when George Harrison says that he nor Ringo ever rehearsed or practiced. They just picked up their instruments when they wrote a song.
Yeah.
So there's that magic of those people together.
Right.
But what I did with this album was I spent more time at first reading about or researching Seventh Son of Seventh Son and listening to Power Slave and Peace of Mind. And then when I would listen to Seventh Son, it was when I would have maybe some kind of epiphany that I hadn't had before. So like the soliloquy thing, I just I'm going to test this. So I'm going to listen to it thinking about it like it's soliloquies. Or when I got more ground on the use of Galen Kruger's amps, and I just went in and I really listened to it. And then after I listened to the whole album, I went and listened to Peace of Mind so I could compare the two, right? So yeah, this was a very different listening for me in a comparative sense, but also in like I can't just put my attention in one place in the Maidenness.
Yeah.
It's got to go around.
It's much more expansive.
And I have to say that it's really notable to say that about a band, that you can't just, or I can't, listen to just this thing. I have to enter into their domain. I have to enter into their realm for a little while. And then I'm satiated, and then I let it go for a while. But I know that the next time I listen to a Maiden tune, no, I got to listen to this, and I got to listen to that. It's really quite interesting. I mean, I have it with some other things, for sure. But Maiden is... When I was doing research and reading people's comments and about Maiden and that, there was one person who said, when Maiden goes, we're all going to feel it. And I thought, for those of us who appreciate Maiden, I think that's very true. Like, it's amazing how they're all still doing it at their age, and they still have, like, I watched their recent live performances, and all of the enthusiasm is still there.
Yeah, and that's and these guys are so good now on, and they were then too, but they are so good on their instruments.
Yeah,
Harris is just like what he does.
That's
on the
what I
bass,
want to get into on the Aftercast.
We'll definitely talk more about that for sure. Yeah, because there's so much to break down that I think is going to be great to talk about. But it definitely gets probably a little uber nerdy as we get into all those little minute musical elements of how
sounds good.
The bass is played. So but isn't that so crazy and so cool that we both had that? Like, I was listening to Maiden in a way that I'd not listened to Maiden before, even. Okay. Like I said, I was familiar, with Maiden from, grade 8, when Number of the Beast was out, and I can remember learning that song but being a little, on guitar but being a little sort of cautious about what these guys were all about, because I just didn't know. And loved Run to the Hills. And so, like, both those songs, like, they're both, one's a cartoon and the other's like a historical narrative, sort of,
yes. Yeah.
And there's nothing, shocking about either that would make you, not just embrace them as a band. I mean, it's all right there in those two songs. But it took me a little while to become a fan beyond what I heard on radio or through kids and stuff. So, like, very much from those albums, I was a periodic listener.
Right.
When I didn't buy or a Maiden album or have access to a Maiden album until Power Slave, and then the live album, Live After Death. Is that the one?
Yeah, Live After Death.
Yeah, so I had that and Power Slave, and everything else was through radio or through shared cassette tapes, like blank.
Well,
tapes
that's what it was for me. Is I got a lot of cassettes made for me,
right?
But it's interesting how for me, when I think about metal, that there are bands that they're their own province, their own province.
Yeah,
and Maiden is definitely has their own thing, and it's quite striking to me how you subtly mentioned, and we'll get into it in the Aftercast, the musical tropes, but how, as I've gotten older, there's a finesse to them and a beauty to them that I just can't deny. That even at one point in my life, like when I was in a certain headspace around music composition in my life, that was when a number of musics just kind of were on the sidelines for a while. And I remember thinking about how at one point then about how these are the things that Maiden do, and they don't do anything else.
Yeah.
And now I think, who could do it? That's them.
Yeah.
And just to come in, we're almost wrapped up here. And the other day I found a video that someone shot of Nico McBrain playing with, I don't know how he knows these people, but it looked like it was at someone's backyard party. And he was the only member of Iron Maiden there. And so they had someone singing and the guitar, I think they had a guitar player and a bass player, because the whole shot was only on Nico McBrain playing. And then you could see people watching him and, of course, just being like, this is amazing. But the way that he was playing, I have no doubt that from my own impression of that, I had no doubt that he feels the same way in front of 60,000 people as he does in front of the people in that backyard.
Wow.
He was playing the same.
Wow.
And it was effortless, and he was smiling. He was saying the lyrics sometimes. He was there. And I thought, when I saw that, I thought, that is how I like to think of Maiden. Like, there's other bands, like not just metal bands, there's other bands and musical moments where that's not what's going on. But when I saw that, it was like the last video I've seen. I saw it 2 days ago. So it was the last thing I watched before we did this podcast. I thought to myself, that's how I like to think of Maiden.
Yeah.
They're in I've said it 3 times now, the joie de vivre of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's worth celebrating.
Yeah.
Whether it's in someone's backyard or it's an arena full of screaming people.
Right. So if you had to sum this up for our podcast listening audience who may have come to us or because they liked Sinatra or heard our last episode, or maybe they were jazz fans and heard our Coltrane episode, right. Iron Maiden might be a unfamiliar band to them. Yes. Or they may have had their own sort of exposure but hesitation to get in. What would you say, or how would you want to wrap this up for them in terms of like where this fits in our podcast journey, and what their point of entry might be into it? A convoluted question.
I feel like I'm in university again taking a test.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if this will answer your question directly, but this is what it compels me to say, is that what we're doing here is about music.
Yeah.
And any style of music or any musicians, they all fall under that umbrella of music. So if you are not drawn throughout your day to a certain type of music, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a connection to something else. So I feel like what we do here is we talk about the trees in the forest, but we're actually being very mycelial. And so, like, I talked about Haydn. You mentioned Germanic influence, and then we went medieval in that. And so there's always connective elements between all forms of music. And if one is not compelled to listen to a type of music, like, for example, Iron Maiden doesn't work for you. The piece about that I think that we're getting into by talking about a genre like concept albums is that the fact that it doesn't work for you right now doesn't mean that it's a part of things that have been working for you, or it doesn't have relationships. So I don't know if that answers the spotlight you just put on me.
Yeah, it's a great way to take the pressure off myself to come up with something.
But I think that just the sheer fact that we have these different albums being listed on, next to one another or one after the other, it's just, I feel like we're just presenting the opportunity to say, well, maybe now's the time.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a reason to listen to Sinatra today and Iron Maiden tomorrow. And it's not because of what we said, but because maybe engaging with what we're doing, there might be a connective moment for you. And I mean, I've known a number of people who've told me that they don't like certain types of music without ever hearing them. And that to me is just not my way. I can't speak about another type of music if I haven't heard it.
Yeah.
And I think that, There was a BBC show I believe it came out in the 80s, and it was called Connections. And I can't remember the name of the historian who hosted it, but the whole premise of the show was to make connections through time, these through lines of how this maybe technology led to this, which led to this, which led to this, which led to that. So instead of focusing on just a period of time or a place in the world at a period of time, he was looking at through lines through time,
right,
in history. And I just feel like what we're doing is finding other kinds of, like I mentioned, the mycelial thing. And so you never know what's going to happen when you listen to something that you don't normally listen to. And just give it time. And you and I have also talked about how 3 listens at least, before we can feel like we've touched to maybe the essence or the beginning essence of what we see or feel in something.
Yeah, well, it's very much, I know we're going to wrap up here, but it's very much like the psychology of taste, right? That part of what starts sending the reward centers in your brain ringing, like, ta-da, this is what I want, is the anticipation of a taste, a familiarity that you're anticipating, and then when you taste it, you get that taste, you get rewarded by it. So as people may or may not know, I own a coffee company, and coffee is something we're drinking every day, but part of that reward center for coffee, and whether you're into dark coffee or light coffee or different styles of coffee, part of what you like and why you like it has to do with familiarity. And it takes a while to attune your ear and your taste to build up the anticipation of what you taste for the next time, to set those reward signals off in your brain. It's almost like, you have to qualify the experience to your body or pre-qualify it. And music is very similar. Like, yes, you can hear some music and one listen and it's an earworm, it's in your ear. Usually you've had some predisposition to prep for that in some way. But you would be amazed at how quickly, after 1 or 2 listens, you can get behind any band or any style of music and suddenly build up that ability or that propensity in your own brain to sort of like to really start to make new synaptic connections, both emotionally, because when you first hear it, it's cacophony, right? But your brain will make those connections. It's an organizing, creative entity. So you just got to give it a little exposure and a little time. And I think for anybody, whatever genre you're into, for if there's a positive that comes out of the podcast as a thing, is that if it makes you curious about listening to something, that's awesome. And go out and do it. And but give it a couple of listens for sure, because that's the payoff comes once you've just built up that little bit of primer in your brain to sort of for that breakthrough listen. And when and there's a sublime element to that, especially when it's new music or a new experience. So that's one of the things I love. And this album, it was a pleasure. This whole about 5-6 weeks has been an absolute pleasure. And I'm surprised I didn't bring a Maiden shirt today. Why didn't I? I should have gone out and got a Maiden shirt. But I'm so pleased that this was on both our lists and we did this. So thanks, Joël. This is great.
Thank you. It was great.